Burkina Faso, on the edge of the Sahara, is on the brink of disaster because of a surge in fighting involving various groups. The UN says a humanitarian crisis is unfolding for its 20 million people. So what's behind this violent surge, and could it spread across West Africa? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Burkina Faso used to be best known for hosting the continent's most prestigious film festival in the capital, Ouagadougou. A lot has changed. Now it's better known for an increasing amount of violence. Armed groups are attacking any vestige of the state, and there's growing tension between ethnic groups. The situation is so bad, the UN has warned of an impending disaster. Burkina Faso, along with Mali, Mauritania, Niger and Chad, have been working with European help to improve security in the Sahel. Yet more than 70,000 people have been forced from their homes in Burkina Faso in the last 2 months. Armed groups have attacked schools and hospitals. Furthermore, the US has warned that violence could destabilise the whole region. Let's take a closer look at the unrest. There have been more than 200 attacks since 2016. The think tank, the International Crisis Group, says security began to deteriorate 2 years earlier when longtime President Blaise Compaoré was forced from office after 27 years. The current president, Roch Kaboré, declared a state of emergency in 14 out of 45 provinces at the end of last year. It followed an attack that killed at least 10 soldiers near the border with Mali. The government resigned in January and a new prime minister was appointed. The United Nations estimates that 1.2 million people desperately need aid. Well, let's start our discussion by speaking to one of the most important people in Ouagadougou, and that's the head of the UN office, the UN resident coordinator, Metsi Makhetha. Metsi, can I start by asking you what the situation is like there now in the country, the political situation, the security situation, and the humanitarian situation? It's bad, isn't it?
Well, thank you, James. Listen, as I'm speaking to you, the country is experiencing an unprecedented internal displacement crisis. Only in the past 8 weeks, about 50,000 families were forced to flee their villages due to attacks and threats. And the number brought the number of internally displaced people to more than 100,000. So we have doubled internally displaced persons in less than 2 months. And displacements are averaging about 1,000 people per day. Because of the situation, on February the 14th, the humanitarian community, in support of government response, launched a humanitarian appeal. The appeal is for close to 1 million people who need direct assistance for displaced families as well as host communities. The appeal is requesting $100 million. Just recently, the UN Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator was with me out in the camps where we went to be with the displaced families. What we saw was in a tent that is meant to only have 10 people. There were more than 30 families. And that is the reason we are calling on the humanitarian community and the partners that are focusing on humanitarian support to scale up the response.
I see that, and it's a lot of money that you're asking for. Metsi, it's a lot of money you're asking for. I see that, and quite often these appeals in the UN, you never actually get the money that you're asking for. That's the humanitarian situation, but does the UN need to be asking for help for the government there for the security situation as well? Because just having money to feed people, to shelter people, is not going to stop the attacks from the armed groups.
The government is fully aware of the challenges that it's faced with, and we all know that we have to address the situation from multiple angles and multiple fronts.
When it comes to the security situation, the UN Security Council hasn't even met to discuss the situation in the country. Do you think the UN needs to also be looking at the political and the security situation as well as the humanitarian situation?
You know, as we speak, the responses have to be addressed at multiple levels. You are absolutely correct. There's a political level, there's a development level, as well as a humanitarian level. While the political discussions are ongoing, we right now have to attend to the most pressing needs of populations. We have to be working very closely with the partners to ensure that Burkina Faso sustains its development trajectory, and we have to pull all the stops to make sure that the development trajectory is not halted.
Just tell our viewers, how many staff does the UN have under your command there? Can you just give us the big number?
I am responsible for coordinating about 20 UN agencies. 11 are resident and none are non-resident in Burkina Faso. We have staff located in the field that are supporting directly communities, and that staff accounts for about 100 people that are out, 150 people that are out in the field.
And Metsi, I'm sorry to stop you there because we don't have a lot of time, but it is worth comparing that 150 people with what the UN has next door in Mali, where there are some 16,000, including peacekeepers. And it does seem to me that right now the security situation in the two countries don't seem to be that different. Metsi Makhetha from the United Nations, Resident Coordinator, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Let's discuss all this further with three experts on the country. We have Eloise Bertrand, an independent researcher based in Burkina Faso. She joins us by Skype from Ouagadougou. From London, we have Paul Melly, a consulting fellow in the Africa programme at Chatham House. And in Dakar, in Senegal, we have Adama Gaye, a West Africa analyst and a Senegalese journalist. Can I start by trying to get the three of you to give us the context, how we got to this situation with the security fast deteriorating? Eloise, it seemed to me there are a number of factors. One seems to be problems in other parts of the region, like Mali, Niger, and even Libya. Can you bring us up to speed?
Yes, sure. So obviously, Burkina Faso had been spared until recently, but it was one of the rare countries in the region that had been spared from insecurity. As you say, there were some security issues in neighboring countries. And for a long time, Burkina Faso was spared from this because Blaise Compaoré, the former president, had some kind of unofficial arrangement, and this has come to light now after Blaise Compaoré was toppled by the insurrection. And so obviously now the situation has changed, and the army has seen some reshuffling in Burkina Faso. The intelligence network framework of Burkina Faso has been also damaged by the insurrection, and so now the insecurity that was existing in the rest of the region has come to Burkina Faso, and this is also something that was because it's quite new. I think the new government that came in 2015 was maybe not ready to face it.
Paul, if I can ask you to take on what you've just heard from Eloise, how much do you think the fact that there has been attention on Niger, on Mali, has actually forced some of the problems into Burkina Faso? And how much is this a domestic problem and a domestic created problem after a long-term president who had a very tight grip on things standing down?
Well, I think there are two things going on. Of course, Mali, the central and northern regions of Mali that have been very troubled since 2011, 2012, they have a very long border with Burkina Faso. So there's been some overspill of violence and, for example, jihadist groups that have moved back and forth across the frontier. And it's a very long frontier, and the countries in the region are now creating a joint force which is trying to strengthen security in these border areas, but it is a very difficult military challenge, if you like, and there is inevitably some overspill from Mali. But I think another factor is that Burkina Faso itself has gone through a very distinctive political evolution. It was, from the 80s onwards, regarded as something of a pioneer, of a leading country in terms of grassroots development. And so with an administration that was perceived, if you like, by outside players and by other countries in the region as relatively coherent, relatively well developed. But at the same time, you had, for a very long period in power, Blaise Compaoré, an authoritarian president, who in 2014, effectively in a people power revolution, because he was trying to prolong his stay in power, was turfed out of office. And that led to a transition and a new democratic government elected, and they've had to inherit this situation. And as Eloise was explaining, some of the arrangements that the former president had made with armed groups in the region had helped to shield Burkina Faso, whereas the new democratic government didn't have those arrangements. So it's faced a very difficult challenge. And because of this past perception that Burkina was possibly one of the most strongly administered, better organized countries in the Sahel, there was perhaps international partners were a little bit caught off guard, not quite expecting the scale of pressures that we've seen surging up in Burkina over the last year or so, whereas in Mali, they were used, if you like, international partners were used to the idea that the situation was very fragile. So you've had a combination of things coming together, a distinctive political history with Burkina trying to come to terms with some very difficult episodes in its past.
Let me bring in Adama.
Investigations and trials.
Let me bring in Adama in Dakar. Adama, also the backdrop to all of this is a very, very poor country. Tell us how the economy and the poverty of the people, the lack of healthcare plays into the situation, the deteriorating situation on the ground.
Of course, that's one of the aspects of the problem in Burkina Faso, which is, first of all, a landlocked country. It's a vast country, and the state is not always present across the land, so that forces, special forces, militant forces can operate freely and play the role that the state is not providing. Let's say schools, jobs, infrastructures, and other amenities are provided by foreign forces, especially those that spilled over the country after the collapse of Gaddafi, and the tension started being strong in Mali next door, in Niger, even in Chad and Boko Haram in Nigeria. But also, you have another aspect that one needs to consider, the fact that democratization in Africa, including in Burkina Faso, has given the reign of power to people who have not been really very effective in managing the state. They sit in their offices, drive beautiful cars, and really make the best speeches. At the end of the day, they don't deliver the goods. And I think this is really, really, really at the core of the problem. They need to get out of their offices, be competent leaders in order to provide the type of leadership that these impoverished nations need. After all, there is another aspect that one has to address. This is the president of the United Nations. African countries have been given control to the United Nations. And these institutions, they have become part of the problem. The international bureaucracy, they also benefit from this kind of aid, leading to an aid fatigue from the international community, giving them means to operate as really wealthy organizations in an impoverished environment.
Okay, Adama, I'm going to stop you there. We're going to talk about the international community, Adama, and what they should do and what they shouldn't do in a moment. But Eloise, very quickly, and this isn't easy to answer quickly, perhaps you could tell us who the different groups are, because from what I've read, there are at least 4 distinct fighting groups involved in taking on the military.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to admit that I'm not a security expert, I'm more a political expert. So there are several groups that exist that are operating in the country. One of them is more Al-Qaeda affiliated, that comes from Mali, and that has, as Paul was saying before, there has been some spillover from Mali, and so they have been active in Burkina Faso. There is also a group that has been founded in Burkina Faso, in the north of Burkina Faso, Ansarul Islam, so this is like a domestic group. It's a Burkinabe group, even though Diko, the founder of this group, had been previously trained in Mali. And those groups are more active around the Malian border and the north of Burkina Faso. But since, I think for the past year, there has been growing insecurity and growing number of attacks in the east of the country, which has, the security there has really rapidly deteriorated. Really, in a matter of months, the number of attacks has skyrocketed. And those attacks have not been claimed by any groups. But there is, there is some belief that those are related more to the Islamic State that comes more from Niger. I mean, the Islamic State in this region, that is more linked to the situation in Niger. So it's like two different.
Okay, Eloise.
Different groups,
I'd like to ask Paul. I mean, that seems a very complex situation that any military and intelligence service in the world would find difficult. Give us your assessment of the abilities of the forces of Burkina Faso. Are they any good at dealing with anything like this, or are they overwhelmed?
I don't think they're overwhelmed, but it is a much more difficult task than what they used to be accustomed to dealing with, because under the Compaoré regime, the Presidential Security Regiment, which was seen as the sort of core of loyalty to him as president, they were privileged, if you like, in terms of military equipment and treatment and training and so on. So since the collapse of the regime, the military really has had to have, it's a question of refreshing it, I guess, and training it in anti-terrorist type activities that it didn't previously really have to engage in. So the military wasn't really equipped for this task. It's a new role, and it's particularly difficult because, as Eloise was explaining, these groups include elements who are spilling over from neighbouring countries, but also elements that are indigenous to Burkina Faso. So it's not just a question of sending in soldiers with a lot of equipment and guns into an area. You have the problem that this is mixed up with intercommunal tensions and grievances, and, for example, competition between livestock herding people and people who are farmers. And so it's as much a question of trying to restore community fabric and trust as it is of direct military intervention, and that makes it even more complicated. And so, as we've seen in Mali, if the international community does deploy large-scale military force, that may sometimes be necessary, but it isn't it isn't the whole of the solution. It can't be all of the solution. And in Burkina Faso, where the underlying political structure and administration is still much stronger than in northern and central Mali, probably it's a question of trying to work out how to strengthen the local forces while also rebuilding trust and community institutions and things like local justice. There had been a phenomenon, for example, of what are called the Kolweogo, which was essentially community, very vindictive community justice, because the official justice system of the state was absent, was inadequate, as Adama was saying.
So
very
a
often
form,
the state is not always
of
present.
vigilantes there on the ground in parts of the country. Adama, it was interesting, Paul was mentioning Mali. What I find fascinating is that when Burkina Faso is dealing with this, it's got so many of its troops actually next door in Mali. It is the 13th largest contributor to UN peacekeeping and has some 3,000 soldiers serving with the UN. Surely they're needed back home now.
Absolutely. Look, the UN peacekeeping operation has become a money-making proposition. People are not going there for peace, but they are just going there to get per diems in order to build their life for themselves. They don't care for the national objectives. So recently I visited Burkina Faso barely a month ago, and I was struck by what I saw in that country. It's like it was a standstill country. For 7 years or 8 years, I've not been there, but I saw a very old airport. Nothing was done to recreate a new airport like in many West African countries. In the streets of Ouagadougou, I could see surprisingly many women dressed like Arabic women with a veil, a black veil, people praying in the street, and also the forces, security forces that were supposed to provide a sense of security. You can see that they are very poor. They are poorly dressed. And I was talking to my driver. I said, these people, if you bribe them, they can accept. They can allow you to do whatever you want in these hotels or on the places. They're securing even the airport.
Okay, so you're painting a picture of a government, Adama, that is struggling with this. Eloise, quickly as we end our discussion, what should the international community do? The French presidency has started of the UN Security Council, yet the UN Security Council hasn't even discussed this crisis once.
First of all, I think that I don't really see the picture as bleak as Adama, I must say, from Ouagadougou. And definitely the security forces need more support, they need more training, they need more equipment. There is a need to make sure that they don't commit abuses. Because in this situation, because there is a growing concern that abuses are being committed by security forces, which obviously is also will feed into the insecurity and the radicalization of some people that will join the armed groups.
Okay, Paul.
So in terms
Paul,
of the
I'd like Paul's view on this as well. Paul, very quickly, as we end our discussion, what do you think the international community should do? 16,000 or so UN personnel in Mali, just about 150 UN staff in Burkina Faso.
Well, I think the situation in Mali is very different. There was effectively a war there, so it's a radically different situation. I think what's really needed in Burkina Faso is probably further support to help the Burkinabe state build up its presence and its capacity, whether it's police, whether it's gendarmes, sometimes the army, but also those vital public services and justice services, the things that, for example, there's a huge number, more than 100,000 Burkinabe children are currently not in school because insecurity has forced teachers to close local schools in some areas. So it's a supporting of the state to rebuild its presence or to reinforce its presence, because Burkina Faso does have a very strong sense of itself and strong political culture. Remember, this is a country that only a few years ago, through people power protest, turfed out a long-standing authoritarian ruler. There's a very powerful political tradition and sense of national pride, and working with that will be much more effective than just trying to sort of copy the sort of heavy-duty intervention that was seen in Mali, for example.
We must leave it there. Thank you to all our guests, Eloise, Bertrand, Paul, Melly and Adama Gaye, giving us a comprehensive picture of a fast-moving story. Inside Stories here every day. You can always catch the programme again by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. We'd like to hear from you too. We're on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, while on Twitter, we're on @AJ Inside Story. Until next time, from me, James Bays, and the team, bye-bye now.